The Hulu original series, Furious, now streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+.
There are 3 victims we know of. The suspect is female, white, late 20s.
Female serial killers
Kill for power, control. I believe there's a deeper motivation here.
You have no idea who you're dealing with, and you are going to end up dead.
I've been waiting for you.
Watch the Hulu original series, Furious, now streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+. For bundle subscribers. Terms apply.
There are some cases where the mystery is simple. Someone disappears, their body is eventually found, and investigators are left trying to determine who killed them. But this isn't exactly one of those cases. The case we're talking about today, authorities say they know exactly what happened, and there wasn't a killer. They say 28-year-old Alfred Wright died accidentally after consuming a combination of drugs, becoming disoriented, running into the woods of East Texas, and eventually dying there. And according to them, the evidence supports that conclusion. But Alfred's family has essentially been saying the same thing for more than a decade. We don't believe you. And when you hear how Alfred disappeared, how his belongings were found scattered through a pasture, how quickly the initial search ended, where his body was eventually discovered, the condition his body was in when it was found, the completely different concerns raised by a pathologist hired by his family, you'll understand why. But I also want to say something before we get into this case. There are a lot of rumors surrounding Alfred Wright's death, and some of those rumors have been repeated so many times online that people now state them as fact. And I'm not going to do that. Throughout this episode, I'm going to tell you what we know, what Alfred's family says, what investigators say, and I'm going to tell you where those 2 versions collide. Because ultimately, that's what this case is about. 2 completely different interpretations of how one man ended up dead in the East Texas woods. Let's talk about Alfred Wright. Alfred Wright was 28 years old in November of 2013. His family called him Alfie. He lived in Jasper, Texas, with his wife Lauren and their children. Alfred was a physical therapist, and from everything I've read about him, Alfred had done what so many parents hope their children will do. He'd gone away to college, built a career, and then returned home. Alfred had been a football player in high school, and even after returning home from college, he was remembered as somebody who remained pretty modest. He was working as a physical therapist and traveling throughout East Texas to see patients. His father would later say that Alfred was traveling those long distances for work because he wanted to buy a new truck for his family. And I think that's a small detail, but it lets us know a little bit more insight into who Alfred was and what his life looked like at the time of his death. He was 28 years old, working, taking care of his family. He was a husband, a daddy, a son, and he had people who loved him. And I want us to remember that as we get further into this case, because eventually the conversation surrounding Alfred's death would become much bigger than just what happened to him. There would be questions about race, law enforcement, the investigation, and whether his family could trust the people who were supposed to find out what happened. And for Alfred's family, that distrust wasn't something that suddenly started when Alfred disappeared. There was history there, particularly for his father, Reverend Douglas Wright. Reverend Douglas Wright had grown up in Mississippi. Douglas was one of 14 children, and as a child, he experienced segregation firsthand. When Mississippi schools began slowly integrating, Douglas and 2 of his sisters were among the Black students who entered a previously white school. He later described being called racial slurs, being spat on, and having teachers essentially tell him that white students were smarter than him. Douglas's own father was a pastor, and one of the churches he preached at was Mount Zion Methodist Church near Philadelphia, Mississippi. That church became associated with civil rights workers during the Freedom Summer. The Ku Klux Klan burned the church down. It was rebuilt and burned again. So when we eventually get to Alfred's disappearance, and you hear Douglas immediately questioning the authorities, I need you to understand something. His distrust did not come out of nowhere. This was a man who had lived through a period of American history where Black families sometimes had very legitimate reasons to question whether the people investigating violence against them were actually interested in finding the truth. Now, fast forward decades. Douglas eventually moved his family to Jasper, Texas, where he became a pastor and worked in the school district. And Jasper has its own complicated racial history. Most of you probably recognize the name Jasper because of the name James Byrd Jr. In 1998, James Byrd Jr., a Black man, accepted a ride from 3 white men. Those white men took him to an isolated area, beat him, chained him behind a pickup truck, and dragged him for miles. It's one of the most horrific racial murders in modern American history. The men responsible were caught and prosecuted, but unfortunately, the case left a permanent mark on Jasper. And Alfred's father had been outspoken about racial issues in that community long before his son's death. So I want you to hold on to all of that, because when Alfred disappears in 2013, his family isn't evaluating what happens in a historical vacuum. They're looking at it through generations of experience. And whether you ultimately agree with the family's theory or with investigators, that context does matter. Thursday, November 7th, 2013, started as a normal workday for Alfred Wright. As a physical therapist, Alfred spent much of his day traveling between patients throughout East Texas. He wasn't just out driving around that afternoon, he was working and traveling between appointments. There's also a detail from earlier that day that would later become important to federal investigators. At 12:36 p.m., according to the federal indictment later filed against Shane Hadnot, Alfred sent Hadnot a text asking to purchase cocaine and other illegal narcotics. That message would eventually become a major part of the government's explanation for what happened to Alfred later that evening. But at the time, Alfred's family knew nothing about those messages. As far as they knew, Alfred was going about his normal workday. Hours later, while traveling through Sabine County, Alfred's Dodge Ram began overheating. Alfred pulled into the parking lot of a CL&M package store located along State Highway 87 just south of Hemphill. At this point, there was nothing particularly unusual about what was happening. Alfred was having car trouble, so he pulled over, started trying to figure out how he was going to get home. While Alfred was outside the store, he reportedly spoke briefly with a Sabine County Sheriff's deputy who had stopped there. According to later reporting, there was nothing about that interaction that suggested Alfred was in immediate danger. Alfred then called his wife, Lauren, and told her that his truck had broken down. Lauren was home with their children and couldn't immediately come to get him. So she contacted Alfred's parents, Reverend Douglas Wright and Rosalind Wright, and asked if they could pick him up. They agreed. So Alfred knew that his parents were on their way. But sometime after that, something changed. At around 6:05 p.m., Alfred spoke with Lauren again. And somewhere around this same period, a clerk at the store reportedly saw Alfred suddenly leave the area running. Not walking away from his truck, running. He headed north along Highway 87 toward Hemphill, and that's one of the first major questions in this case. Why did Alfred run? His truck had broken down, but he had already arranged for someone to pick him up. His parents were on their way. There was no obvious reason for him to leave his truck behind and suddenly take off down the highway. Authorities would eventually argue that Alfred's behavior could be explained by the drugs in his system and the disorientation they believed those drugs caused. But at the moment, nobody knew any of that. All anyone knew was that Alfred had unexpectedly left the place where he was supposed to be waiting for his parents. After leaving the store area, Alfred spoke with Lauren again. This time, Lauren could tell that something wasn't right. Alfred was breathing heavily and sounded distressed. Lauren tried to figure out what was happening and asked him questions, but according to accounts of their conversation, Alfred wasn't giving her clear answers. Then the call ended.
The perfect lunch combo. That first bite of your favorite sub, followed by ice-cold Pepsi. Add a couple of friends, and now that's next level. Suddenly, the laughs get louder, the stories keep flowing, and the food tastes better. Because Pepsi brings out more flavor, more fun, and more of the moment. Food deserves Pepsi. Grab a Pepsi Zero Sugar today.
In the U.S., there's a break-in every 26 seconds. But when intruders step near, Simply Safe Home Security steps up.
Stop. This is Simply Safe. Police are on the way.
Using AI alerts, U.S.-based live agents help deter break-ins. Simply Safe, no long-term contracts. Save 60% on a new system with professional monitoring during our 20th anniversary sale at simplysafe.com/Spotify.
Outdoor deterrence requires a Simply Safe Active Guard outdoor protection plan starting at $49.99 a month. Visit simplysafe.com/licenses for alarm license information. Tennessee 2012.
That would be the last known conversation between Alfred and his wife. Federal prosecutors would later point out that Alfred disappeared approximately 5 hours after the 12:36 p.m. text message to Shane Hadnot requesting drugs. By early evening, Alfred had gone from dealing with an overheated truck and waiting for his parents to suddenly running away from the place where they were supposed to meet him. Roughly an hour after Alfred left the store area, Douglas and Rosalind arrived to pick him up. But Alfred wasn't there. His truck was still sitting in the parking lot, but their son was nowhere to be found. And there was no simple explanation for where he had gone. Douglas and Rosalind had left home believing they were simply going to pick up their son because his truck had broken down. Instead, they arrived to find Alfred's truck still there, but Alfred was gone. What should have been a routine trip to bring their son home had suddenly become something much more concerning. The family reported Alfred missing, and soon law enforcement and volunteers began searching the area around Highway 87. That is how November 7th, 2013 turned from an ordinary workday into the beginning of an 18-day search for Alfred Wright. Searchers began combing the area surrounding the highway. There were volunteers, dogs, horses, law enforcement, firefighters, and at one point, even an airplane was used. But then searchers began finding Alfred's belongings. His clothing was discovered scattered around a field. Some items were caught on or around a barbed wire fence. His belongings were reportedly found approximately a mile from where he had last been seen. Now, picture what investigators are looking at. A man abandons his vehicle. He's seen running. His wife said he sounded distressed, and his clothing starts turning up in a rural area. At some point, tracking dogs reportedly followed Alfred's scent toward a creek, and then they lost it. But here's where the Wrights family began becoming increasingly frustrated. Alfred disappeared on a Thursday. By Monday, the official ground search was called off. 4 days. And yes, 4 days of searching can involve a tremendous amount of manpower. But to Alfred's family, the decision was incomprehensible. Their son hadn't come home. Nobody heard from him. His belongings were scattered around the countryside, and there still was no Alfred. According to later reporting, some volunteers who wanted to help search were turned away for various reasons, including concerns over clothing, physical fitness, or arriving too late. Sheriff Tom Maddox said restrictions were necessary partly because the terrain was dangerous and because it was deer season. But Alfred's family believed authorities had given up too soon. And there was something else bothering them: the attitude. A Hemphill officer reportedly made a joke on Facebook suggesting Alfred might simply be somewhere enjoying himself. Sheriff Maddox publicly speculated that Alfred could have gone off on some type of bender and might eventually return. Maddox maintained there was no evidence pointing toward foul play. And listen, law enforcement cannot automatically call every disappearance a murder. They can't. And we get that. But put yourself in the family's position. Your son has disappeared, his truck is abandoned, his clothes are scattered through a pasture, and people are already talking as though maybe he's just off somewhere partying. His father was furious, and the longer Alfred remained missing, the more suspicious his family became. November 7th became November 8th, then November 9th. Then a week. 2 weeks. Still no Alfred. And eventually his family decided, if you're not going to keep looking for him, we will. On November 25th, 2013, 18 days after Alfred disappeared, his family, friends, and volunteers organized another search. A private investigator named Chuck Foreman helped organize the volunteers. Teams were divided into groups. They were given maps and walkie-talkies, and they entered some extremely rough East Texas terrain. Briars, creeks, mud, thick vegetation. And remember, this was during hunting season. These people weren't walking around a city park, but they were determined to find Alfred. One of the search team leaders was an ex-Marine named Utora Kupinda. About 3 hours into the search, the wind shifted, and Kupinda smelled something. If you've ever been around decomposition, unfortunately, you know that there is a very distinct smell. Kupinda recognized it. He followed the odor toward a dense wall of bush and thorns. He pushed through and entered a small clearing. There in a ditch was a body, face down. The man was wearing underwear, shoes, and one sock. Kupinda radioed the others. A body had been found. Alfred's father rushed toward the scene. He recognized the tattoo across his son's back. Angel wings. It was Alfred. 18 days after Alfred Wright disappeared, his family had found him. And this is where everything changes. Because Alfred wasn't discovered miles and miles away. His body was found in the general area of the original search. According to later federal records, his body was in a brush near where his clothing had been found. Other reporting described it roughly 100 yards from the fence where some of his clothing had been discovered. The Wright family said that this was an area they wanted searched previously. So immediately they had a question. How did everybody miss him? Dogs, deputies, volunteers, search teams, an airplane. How was Alfred lying there and nobody found him? Now, there are possible explanations. Dense woods can hide a body surprisingly well. Searches are not perfect. A person can walk within feet of something and never see it. It happens. But the family didn't see this as an innocent oversight. Not anymore, because now their missing son was dead, and his body raised even more questions. What happened after Alfred's body was discovered tells you how little trust his father had left. Law enforcement arrived at the scene, but Douglas Wright did not want his son's body simply removed before the scene was properly handled. When Texas Ranger Danny Young arrived, Douglas requested another ranger. Douglas knew Young, but he also knew Young had previously worked with Sheriff Maddox. And at this point, Douglas didn't want there to be even the appearance that people involved were too closely connected. Another ranger, Steve Rayburn, would have to travel from Lufkin. That meant waiting until the next morning. So Douglas stayed outside overnight in the cold and rain near his son's body. Think about that. His father spent 18 days trying to find his child. And once he finally found him, he refused to leave. He sat there in a folding chair through the night because he wanted to make sure nothing happened before another investigator arrived. That tells you everything you need to know about the level of distrust that had developed. The next morning, Alfred's body was removed and transported for examination. And that's when the next battle began. Alfred's family hired its own forensic pathologist. Naturally, they wanted another opinion. And now they were being told those things did not mean what they believed they meant. They had seen the condition of his neck. They had seen what was missing from his face and body. They saw Alfred. That difference matters because the Wright family was not reacting to an abstract autopsy report. There were also shallow puncture wounds noted in preliminary reporting, but the official examination still said there was no evidence of severe or fatal trauma. Those are not mutually exclusive statements. When we're explaining why this case became so controversial, authorities disputed that interpretation. The family said his throat looked cut. And personally, I think both of those facts belong in this episode. So when you hear the statement, Alfred's throat was slit, understand that this is a central allegation made by the family and repeated in national reporting. But it was not accepted by the official autopsy as proof of a homicidal neck wound. Texas Rangers reportedly said that at least one incision seen around the neck had been made during the first autopsy. When CNN later examined the case, its reporting noted that Alfred's throat appeared to have been cut. Now, there is one additional complication regarding the neck. To the official medical examiner, the body's condition did not establish homicidal trauma, and postmortem decomposition and animal or insect activity could account for much of what the family was seeing. To Alfred's family, his throat was cut. His ear was gone. His tongue was missing. His eyes were gone. Teeth and fingernails were missing. And those things looked like evidence that someone had attacked him. And this is why you'll hear the same physical details described two very different ways, depending on who's telling the story. The medical examiner reported no fatal trauma and attributed changes to Alfred's body to decomposition and animal or insect activity. The official autopsy did not conclude that Alfred had been tortured or intentionally mutilated. But I also need to tell you exactly where the disagreement is, because this is what the family says they saw when their son and brother was recovered. And I don't want to remove them from Alfred's story simply because authorities disputed what caused those injuries. Those descriptions are important. His sister, Anelia Wright Mosley, would later describe the condition of his body in even stronger terms, saying she believed his tongue had been cut out, his eyes had been gouged, his throat had been slit, and an ear had been cut off. They also said his throat appeared to have been cut. Family members publicly described Alfred as having a missing ear, missing teeth, fingernails, missing eyes, and a missing tongue. They believed they were looking at evidence of violence. And Alfred's family did not look at what they saw and thought, this looks like somebody who simply died from an overdose. When Alfred was found, his body was badly decomposed and visibly disfigured. Let's slow down here because this is one of the most important and most disputed parts of Alfred Wright's case. The Wright family's legal team retained forensic pathologist Dr. Lee Ann Grossberg to independently examine Alfred, and Grossberg initially raised serious concerns. At a December 2013 press conference, she said that despite the advanced decomposition, she had observed enough trauma to have a high suspicion of homicidal violence. Now, notice the wording, suspicion. Not definitive proof that Alfred was murdered, but enough concern that she believed homicide needed to be seriously considered. That was completely different from what the family had been hearing from authorities. And you can imagine what that did, because now the Wright family felt validated. They had been saying from the beginning, something happened to Alfred. And now they had a medical professional publicly saying there were findings she considered suspicious. Then the official autopsy results were released, and they told a very different story. The official autopsy found no fatal trauma. Toxicology testing detected cocaine, methamphetamine, and Xanax. Investigators ultimately concluded that Alfred died from combined drug intoxication. His death was classified as accidental. According to the government's eventual reconstruction of events, Alfred had consumed a combination of substances. The drugs caused him to become extremely disoriented and behave irrationally. He ran from the store, entered the countryside, lost pieces of his clothing while moving through the terrain, and eventually he died in the woods. And I know some of y'all are probably already saying, okay, Steph, well, where did the drugs come from? Because that becomes the next major part of this investigation. And this is where a man named Shane Hadnot enters the story. Investigators began examining Alfred's communication before his disappearance, and they discovered that Alfred had been communicating with 28-year-old Shane Dwayne Hadnot. Hadnot lived in Jasper, According to federal investigators, Hadnot was selling cocaine to Alfred. And this wasn't based solely on somebody saying, I heard Alfred bought drugs from him. Investigators had phone records, witness statements, and drug evidence recovered during a search of Hadnot's vehicle. Federal investigators said that during the 2 days before Alfred died, Alfred and Hadnot exchanged approximately 20 text messages. 20. And according to the federal indictment, at 12:36 p.m. on November 7th, the same day Alfred disappeared, Alfred sent Hadnot a message requesting cocaine and other illegal narcotics. Approximately 5 hours later, Alfred was missing. That is important evidence. And this is one of those places where I don't think we do Alfred any favors by pretending that evidence doesn't exist. If we're asking what happened to him, we have to look at everything, right? Even the evidence his family didn't necessarily want to be the explanation. Now, investigators believe Hadnot supplied Alfred with drugs, and eventually federal prosecutors took action. By early 2014, the case had become national news. CNN covered Alfred's death. Civil rights activists became involved. Protests were held. The Wright family publicly demanded outside investigators look into what happened. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee pushed the Department of Justice to become involved, and eventually, federal authorities, Texas Rangers, and the DEA investigated the circumstances surrounding Alfred's death.
The perfect lunch combo. That first bite of your favorite sub, followed by ice-cold Pepsi. Add a couple of friends, and now that's next level. Suddenly, the laughs get louder, the stories keep flowing, and the food tastes better. Because Pepsi brings out more flavor, more fun, and more of the moment. Food deserves Pepsi. Grab a Pepsi Zero Sugar today.
Okay, real talk, shopping doesn't always boost your confidence. Sometimes you just want to put something on and think, yes, this is me. That's why Stitch Fix works. You take a quick style quiz, size, budget, what you're into, and a real human stylist sends pieces picked just for you. Try everything on at home, keep what you love, send back the rest. Shipping's free, no subscription required. Get $20 off at stitchfix.com/Spotify.
In August of 2014, a federal grand jury indicted Shane Hadnot. Initially, those charges were extremely serious. He was charged with drug trafficking, alleging distribution resulting in death. Federal authorities alleged that the drugs Hadnot supplied contributed to Alfred's death, but ultimately, Hadnot did not plead guilty to killing Alfred. He pled guilty to possession with intent to distribute cocaine. And in April 2015, he was sentenced to 87 months in federal prison, 7 years and 3 months. Federal prosecutors said the evidence surrounding Hadnot's drug activity helped explain what happened to Alfred. But the Wright family absolutely rejected the idea that this solved their son's death. Because from their perspective, proving Alfred used drugs did not prove that nobody hurt him. And that's a very significant point. Those are two different questions. Did Alfred use illegal drugs? The evidence strongly indicates yes. Did those drugs cause his death? Authorities say yes. But Alfred's family believes no, or at minimum believes that drug intoxication doesn't explain everything that happened to him. So let's put the official theory together from beginning to end. According to investigators, Alfred had been obtaining illegal drugs from Shane Hadnot. On November 7th, Alfred communicated with Hadnot about purchasing drugs. Later that day, Alfred's truck overheated near Hemphill. He stopped at the liquor store. At some point, Alfred was under the influence of cocaine, methamphetamine, and Xanax. The combination affected his behavior. He became distressed and disoriented. He ran from the area despite knowing his family was coming to get him. He entered the surrounding rural terrain. As he moved through the fences, brushes, woods, clothing, and belongings became scattered. Eventually, Alfred died. His body remained outside long enough for decomposition, insects, and animals to significantly alter it. When his body was discovered 18 days later, those post-mortem changes appeared traumatic to his family. But according to the official medical examination, there was no fatal physical trauma demonstrating that Alfred had been murdered. His cause of death was combined drug intoxication. His manner of death was accidental. That's the government's explanation. And if you look only at the toxicology, the communication with had not, the drug evidence, and the lack of medically established fatal trauma, you can understand how investigators reached that conclusion. But now, let's look at why Alfred's family says that still doesn't make sense. Question number 1. Why did Alfred run? His parents were coming to get him. His wife had spoken to him. His vehicle had broken down. Why suddenly sprint away from the store? Authorities say drugs explain that behavior. His family wonders whether Alfred was afraid of something or someone. Question number 2. Why did he sound distressed during his final conversation with Lauren? Again, intoxication can cause panic, paranoia, confusion, and erratic behavior. But his wife didn't simply describe him as intoxicated. She believed that something was wrong. Question number 3. Why were his clothes scattered? Investigators believe Alfred moving through rough terrain while intoxicated could explain this. But his family questioned some of the clothing evidence, including a piece of his medical scrubs reportedly found on a barbed wire fence. Douglas Wright pointed out that he grew up in the country. He knew what clothing looked like after being ripped on barbed wire, and he didn't believe what he saw made sense. Question number 4. How did the first search miss Alfred's body? This remains one of the biggest sticking points for the family. Authorities searched the area for days. Dogs were used. Volunteers searched. And then 18 days later, Alfred's family organized another search and found him within hours. Now again, search teams miss bodies. It happens, especially in dense vegetation. But to a family already convinced authorities hadn't taken the disappearance seriously, finding Alfred in the general search area reinforced every suspicion they had. Question number 5. Why did the family's pathologist initially express suspicion of homicidal violence? That's important. It does not prove homicide, but it explains why the Wrights refused to simply accept accidental death from combined drug intoxication and move on. And then there's the question that sits underneath everything else. Race. This is where I think we have to be responsible. Alfred Wright was a Black man who disappeared in East Texas. His father had personally experienced racism throughout his life. Jasper was internationally associated with one of the most notorious racial murders, and nearby Hemphill had its own troubling history. In 1987, Loyal Gardner Jr., a Black truck driver from Louisiana, died after being beaten while in police custody in Hemphill. Law enforcement officers were eventually convicted in connection with his death. So when Alfred's family saw what they believed was a poorly handled investigation into the disappearance of a Black man, history had no other choice but to matter. And as a Black woman from Texas, I understand why. I do think it's fair for us to separate understandable suspicion from evidence. That's a responsible thing to do, right? There is no established evidence proving Alfred Wright was murdered because he was Black. There were rumors, theories. There were allegations involving white people in the area. There were even rumors involving Sheriff Maddox's daughter because she knew Alfred professionally. But those rumors never became proof of a racial murder. And I don't want to take that very real history of racism in East Texas and use it to manufacture evidence that doesn't exist, because we don't need to do that. The legitimate questions surrounding Alfred's case are troubling enough. And I think that's the fairest place to leave the evidence before we talk about where the investigation ultimately ended. So we're left with evidence supporting the official conclusion and legitimate reasons Alfred's family continued asking questions about the investigation and the condition of his body. What we do not have is established evidence proving that Alfred was murdered, tortured, or killed because of his race. There is an important limitation here. In the public reporting I reviewed, Grossberg's comments were described as a preliminary, and she said she still needed photographs and other materials from the first autopsy to evaluate some of the missing tissues around Alfred's neck and face. I did not find a later publicly available final written report from Grossberg that definitively changed or resolved that position. But none of that changes what Alfred's family saw when his body was recovered, or why they questioned whether decomposition and scavenging explain every disturbing feature. Their independent pathologist, Dr. Lee Ann Grossberg, publicly said her examination produced findings suspicious for homicidal violence and that she had a high index of suspicion for homicide. A separate forensic toxicologist retained during the federal investigation also concluded that the findings were consistent with combined drug intoxication and stimulant-related delirium, which investigators believed could help explain Alfred's agitation, running, and removal or loss of clothing. The official autopsy did more than simply note that drugs were present. It concluded that Alfred died from combined drug intoxication and classified the manner of death as accidental. Contemporary reporting on the report said cocaine and its byproducts were within a lethal range, along with methamphetamine and amphetamine. Federal investigators later said additional experts in pathology, toxicology, and anthropology agreed with the combined drug intoxication conclusion. The drug evidence is real. Federal investigators documented 20 text messages between Alfred and Shane Hadnot during the 2 days before Alfred disappeared, including a 12:36 p.m. message on November 7th requesting cocaine and other illegal narcotics. So after all of that, what can we responsibly say? On December 10, 2014, Shane Hadnot pled guilty to possession with intent to distribute cocaine. On April 21, 2015, a federal judge sentenced him to 87 months in prison. The United States Attorney's Office said investigators had established the factual context explaining why Alfred died. According to federal authorities, Alfred's death was accidental. Combined drug intoxication, no murder, prosecution followed. No one has been convicted of killing Alfred Wright because officially Alfred Wright was not murdered. But for his family, the case never reached the type of closure authorities believed it had, because the question they were asking wasn't simply, did Alfred use drugs? They wanted to know what happened to Alfred between the moment he ran from that store and the moment he died in those woods. And unless somebody was with Alfred during those final hours, there are pieces of that story only Alfred knew. What stays with me about Alfred's case isn't that I can sit here and tell you I know exactly what happened. I don't. There is meaningful evidence behind the official conclusion. This wasn't a situation where authorities simply found drugs in Alfred's system and decided that was the end of the story. The medical examiner concluded combined drug intoxication caused his death, and other experts reviewed the evidence, and investigators uncovered communication connecting Alfred to a cocaine supplier. But I understand why his family still struggled to accept that conclusion. They watched an official search end without finding their son. Then they organized their own search and found Alfred in the same general area. And when they saw his body, his missing ear, eyes, tongue, teeth, the missing or damaged tissue, and what they believed looked like a cut to his throat, they believed somebody hurt him. The official medical examiner did not interpret those findings the same way. Decomposition and animal or insect activity were cited for much of the damage, and authorities disputed that the condition of Alfred's neck established a homicidal wound. That's the part I don't want us to lose. And I think this is also where we have to have a larger conversation about why Black people can have a healthy amount of suspicion when something doesn't seem right. I'm not saying every suspicious death involving a Black person is a murder. And I'm not saying every investigation is a cover-up. I'm definitely not saying we should ignore evidence because it doesn't support what we believed happened. But I am saying that our suspicion didn't come from nowhere. There's history behind it. And we've seen this play out in cases we've covered here on Murder in the Black. We covered Tamala Horsford in Georgia. Tamala was the only Black woman at an adult sleepover, and the next morning she was found dead in the backyard. Her death was ruled accidental. but her family and supporters had questions about the circumstances surrounding her death and how the investigation was handled. More recently, we talked about Nolan Wells in Mississippi, another case where the circumstances surrounding the death left his family members and the community asking questions. And now, as I'm recording this in August of 2026, we're watching another case unfold in Mississippi. 29-year-old Tasia Fortune, a Black mother of 4, was found hanging from a tree behind a vacant home in Jackson on August 3rd. And I want to be very clear here because Tasia's case is still developing. As of this recording, her cause and manner of death have not been determined. Her autopsy is pending, and authorities have not determined that she was murdered. So I'm not bringing up Tamala, Nolan, or Tasia to say that the same thing happened to all of them. That's not the parallel. The parallel is the reaction these circumstances can create within the Black community and understanding where that reaction comes from. Because when you tell Black people that a Black woman has been found hanging from a tree in Mississippi, you cannot expect us to hear that without also hearing the history attached to it. We know the history of lynching in this country. We know there was a time when Black people could be found hanging from trees and everybody in town knew what happened, but somehow nobody knew who did it. We know there were Black families who couldn't depend on law enforcement to investigate the deaths of their loved ones because sometimes the very people who were supposed to protect them were involved, looked the other way, or simply didn't believe a Black person's death deserved the same attention. That's history. So when we say something doesn't look right, I think it's understandable for Black people to say, okay, show me. Show me how you reached that conclusion. Show me that you looked at every possibility. Show me that you didn't dismiss something because of who this person was. Show me that you treated their life with the same importance you would want someone to give your own family. And that's different from saying, I don't believe anything law enforcement says. That's different from automatically deciding something was a murder. A healthy amount of suspicion means I'm willing to listen to evidence, but I'm also willing to ask questions. And when you understand that history, Alfred's father's reaction makes even more sense. Douglas Wright didn't suddenly become suspicious of institutions when Alfred disappeared in 2013. This was a Black man who had lived through segregation himself. His family had direct connections to the Civil Rights era. He knew what had happened to James Byrd Jr. right there in Jasper. So when his son disappeared, the official search ended without finding him. And then his family went back into those woods and found Alfred themselves. You can't separate Douglas's reaction from everything he had already experienced and everything he knew had happened to Black people before him. That doesn't prove Alfred was murdered, but it helps explain why his family wasn't willing to hear accidental death and simply stop asking questions. We can tell the family exactly what the medical evidence says without sanitizing what they actually saw and why it frightened them. And Alfred's drug use doesn't erase him either. He was still a husband, a father, a son, a brother, and a physical therapist. Whatever choices he made, he was worthy of being found and having the circumstances of his death investigated thoroughly. So the question I'm leaving with y'all isn't whether Alfred was perfect. That's irrelevant. The question is whether the official conclusion of accidental death from combined drug intoxication answers the circumstances of November 7th and everything that followed well enough for you. For Alfred's family, it never did. Let me know what you think about all of this in a comment. Let's have a conversation this week because I think this really brings a historical context to a lot of the cases we see unfolding and cases that we see happen in our community time and time and time again. And outsiders that are not inside of our community don't understand why we have a healthy amount of suspicion. They don't understand why we just don't accept the official word because they're only looking at it outside of the context. Context matters. Before you go, if you enjoyed today's episode and you're not already following Murder in the Black, make sure you hit that follow or subscribe button wherever you're listening. And if you want even more Murder in the Black, make sure you check out our paid subscription. Our paid subscribers get access to additional cases, bonus content, original true crime series, and episodes you simply won't hear on the main feed. And if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts, remember you can start a 3-day free trial and see if the subscription is for you. Your support helps us continue telling these stories, highlighting cases that don't always receive the attention they deserve, and most importantly, remembering the people behind the headlines. Also, make sure you're following us on social media so you don't miss Storytime with Steph on Wednesdays, What I Watched in True Crime, just in case you needed something to watch for the weekend, and case updates, and everything else we have going on outside of the podcast. Thank you, as always, for listening. Until next time, this is Murder in the Black. Thank you.